All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone in person and online. Thank you for joining us for our sort of delayed Science Friday from June, which is fun because we never have a Science Friday in July because it always falls around the 4th or on the 4th as it was this year. So thank you to our friends group for in person. If you're here, we have refreshments. Feel free to go and grab them at any point. And joining us today is Dr. Joseph Schmitt, who works at the USGS Great Lakes Center as a research biologist, fish biologist, and he's going to talk about, surprise, fish today. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe. I'm going to move this off the screen so you can see what you're doing, and then we should be good to go. Is that going to be no way?
Well, thanks for having me. Sorry it's delayed. I tore a tendon in my finger and had to get a little surgery done. But yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about Lake Erie Cisco. I'm a research fish biologist at the USGS Great Lakes Science Center. We have an office right here in Huron now. We used to be in Sandusky at NASA. But we recently moved, and we have a large research vessel program that we go out on Lake Erie and do various surveys. But today I'm talking about Cisco, which, because they've been extinct for a while, have not really been a topic of discussion until rather recently. And I'd like to keep it fairly informal. If you have like a pressing question or comment, because there's, I don't know, there's what, 15 of us in here, just raise your hand and I'll pause and I'll address it. Yes.
I was just curious, why NASA for like your headquarters? Like, what does
That's a really good question, isn't it?
what does Great Lakes Research have to do with like NASA work?
So we were just renting space from them, and that agreement goes back, I don't know how far. The Great Lakes Science Center has been around since the 1890s, but it's changed names dozens of times. We were the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries, and then we were the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then the National Biological Survey, and yada yada. But for whatever reason, going back, I think to the 50s, we started renting space from NASA. And it was kind of a pain because our boat was here in Huron, and all of our facilities were in NASA, and we were like way back in NASA. Like you had to go like 3 miles to get to our office, and you had to go through security. So every time we were preparing for field surveys, it was just a ton of back and forth and everything took forever. So we're glad to be in Huron. We have deep water access there. The boat's not there currently because we have an issue with the seawall. It's in Cleveland. But ideally, we'll have the boat right next to the office, which makes life easier. But yeah, to answer your question, why they arranged it that way, I'm not sure. They just came up with some agreement. We rented space. The office that we were in right next to us was the FBI, and right above us was USDA. So there's a bunch of people that were renting space there, or a bunch of agencies rather. So, but anyways, back to Cisco. Let's see. It's not gonna work. Use the computer. There we go. So just to touch base on the historical significance of Cisco, and not a lot of people are familiar with this. Some probably are, but Lake Erie Cisco supported the largest freshwater fishery in the world, and perhaps in human history. And it really peaked in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. This image here is there's a Canadian gillnet tug called the Earl Bess, and it's unloading a typical catch of Cisco in Sandusky in, I believe, 1912. And as you can tell, they're like knee deep in fish, right? And so there was this huge fishery. In 1918, it was 49 million pounds recorded, harvested in Lake Erie. And I'll put that in perspective in the next slide, but 49 million pounds is ridiculous. And to cut to the chase, obviously they went extinct at some point, probably because of overfishing, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the fishery during the heyday from like 1890 to 1925 averaged about 26 million pounds a year. And so it was this huge, I'll admit this person real quick. This huge fishery. And so I went through the kind of recent commercial harvest data for all the Great Lakes to kind of put this in perspective. And so the lighter blues to the left, those are modern harvest rates for all of the Great Lakes, for all species aggregated. So for like Lake Erie, it would be walleye, yellow perch, white bass, lake whitefish, and anything, rainbow smelt, everything aggregated, right? So if you look to the left, this is from 2000 to 2020. Lake Erie's winning, no surprise, super productive. About 28 million pounds a year is what it produces. And, you know, the other lakes are much bigger, much greater water volume. The next highest commercial harvest is in Lake Michigan, and it's less than half of Lake Erie. So Lake Erie is a powerhouse. But to the right, this is Cisco historically in Lake Erie. And if you look at the long-term average for the data that I have, obviously it's kind of data deficient because it was 1890s, early 1900s. Cisco alone averaged about 26 million pounds a year. So that's almost equal to all species aggregated today. And then in 1918, that 49 million pounds, it's about equal to if you added all of the Great Lakes, all commercial harvest, all species together, all the lighter blue. That's 51 million pounds. Lake Erie, Cisco was 49 million pounds. So it's just insane. So no surprise, they went extinct, right? But I don't think a lot of people were aware of the scale of this fishery. It's kind of got lost in time. And so Sandusky, Ohio was the fishing capital of the world at the time. There was about 2,000 people directly employed in the fishing industry, and there was thousands more that indirectly supported it. And a lot of this was due to the proximity to major rail hubs. And so they were able to ship Cisco out. They canned them, processed them, and shipped them out to major cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Buffalo. And if you go back to the turn of the century, around 1900, and you look at the largest cities in the U.S., it was New York, Chicago, but then it was actually Cleveland and Detroit. Those were the two big hubs. You know, they've kind of gone down in the rankings since then. But this is where, you know, the majority of the U.S. population resided. And so it's funny, I was looking through old reports, and Cisco were often marketed as white salmon. And so it's funny, you know, 120 years later, we're still using the same marketing gimmicks today. But they were doing those kind of things back then as well. There's a lot of nonsense then. But I never really talked about, you know, what a Cisco is. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with lake whitefish. Have you ever eaten smoked lake whitefish? It's just basically a smaller whitefish. I would say, having had both, it's a little better. It's maybe like how yellow perch is a little better than walleye. I would say Cisco is a little better than whitefish, but very similar. And so they're often smoked, canned, and shipped around. So yeah, again, so the fishery really boomed. It kind of coincided with the peak of the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, rail transit was booming. We had major rail lines going everywhere. But then another big part of the equation here locally was the extensive ice harvesting operations that happened in Sandusky Bay. So I didn't realize that was a major operation around that time period. We don't get nearly the ice now that we did then. But yeah, here's a picture of, I believe that's an ice house in Sandusky. But there's these big operations which allowed them to preserve the fish and then ship them out. And then the advent of steam power was a big contributor. And so we had these steam-powered gill net tugs, and we actually even had steam-powered gill net lifters. So instead of you having to lift the net manually, you could throw it on a machine and let it do the heavy lifting. And then last but not least, bull nets. I don't know if everyone's familiar with those. I'm sure folks around here are familiar with gill nets. Your average gill net, there's an image there in the bottom corner. Net depth, ooh, hold on. Let me go back. Yeah, so the depth of your average gill net might be 6 to 8 feet, right? And it's a passive entanglement gear. Fish swim by, they get entangled in it, so on and so forth. These bull nets, panel depth would be upwards of 30 to 35 feet. And so if they were to set these nets in the west basin of Lake Erie, say when Cisco were migrating to the reefs to spawn, they could cover the water column from top to bottom, and any school of fish that tried to swim through would just get obliterated. And so, leading to the next slide, they did get obliterated. Shocking. Cisco collapsed. I think the big collapse was 1924. And then by 1925, they were pretty well on their way out. And so that caused the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and Michigan to request for federal assistance. And this is actually part of the legacy of the Great Lakes Science Center, who I work for. We weren't called that back then. I believe we were the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries. But John Van Oosten was a fish biologist that was sent to investigate the Cisco collapse in Lake Erie. And he was kind of one of the founding members of our Science Center, which is pretty cool to have that history. But anyways, he went around from port to port. There wasn't a lot of data. And so he kind of had to interview commercial fishermen to figure out what was going on. And he determined most likely it was overfishing. You know, they talked about the bull nets, and they talked about there was actually a lot of waste at the time. If other boats were dropping a lot of their catch at ports, the market would get saturated, you know, supply and demand economics. The price would go down, and sometimes these commercial harvesters would just dump their catch. If they couldn't get a good market price for it, they would just basically dump all the fish off the side of the boat. So not surprisingly, they went extinct, and overfishing was the most likely cause of that extinction. It's funny, if you go back to some of this kind of historical research papers and literature, there was this big debate between John Van Oosten and Thomas Langlois, who was a professor at Stone Lab with Ohio State. And so he was in the West Basin, and he was pushing the narrative that it was water quality issues. It was nutrient runoff. It was eutrophication that was driving the collapse. And then John Van Oosten was pushing, oh, no, it's overfishing. And they fought back and forth. And it's really kind of entertaining to read those old papers. The reality is they were both right. Shocking. While the overfishing was occurring, we were seeing major habitat degradation, especially in the West, as you guys are well aware. They were essentially functionally extinct by 1960. They would occasionally show up in surveys here and there, but they were super rare after that. So leading to present times, that's kind of a little background on the Cisco fishery and their importance. So in the last, I would say, probably since I started here, since 2019, probably the last 6 years, there's been this big Great Lakes-wide movement towards Cisco restoration in the other lakes as well, because they all have native Cisco populations that have also suffered. They haven't gone extinct like they are in Lake Erie, but they've struggled with, you know, with eutrophication issues, invasive species, overfishing. All of those things have contributed to depleted stocks in the other lakes as well. And so there's this big movement towards Cisco restoration and rehabilitation across the Great Lakes Basin. A lot of this is kind of led by the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. USGS is playing a big role in that as well. And so that's providing funding and science support for Cisco restoration work. And so as a biologist on Lake Erie, with all this momentum building, we kind of had to sit down and think, okay, Cisco are extinct here. What can we do to become kind of part of this movement? And so after sitting down and conversing with colleagues, we kind of had two pressing questions for Lake Erie. Obviously, a lot has changed in the last 100 years. And Cisco do require kind of cold water habitat. I wouldn't say their requirements are as strict as, say, a lake trout, but they require cool oxygenated water more so than, say, a walleye or a yellow perch. So we needed to see, you know, was the habitat still here? You know, we have these harmful algal blooms. We have certainly seasonal hypoxia in the Central Basin. That's been going on for a long time, but there does seem to be some evidence that it's maybe worse lately. And so addressing that question, okay, if we're going to move towards Cisco restoration, do we even still have the habitat for them? And then we wanted to like more definitively answer the question, are there any remnant Cisco populations still out there? You know, we listed them as functionally extinct, but Lake Erie is pretty big. What is it, the 11th largest lake or the 13th? I mean, it's huge, right? And so there could be little remnant populations hiding that we're just not aware of. And if that was the case, if we were to kind of initiate a stocking program, you wouldn't want to put, say, fish from Lake Huron or Lake Ontario on top of a remnant, possibly genetically distinct group of fish, because you could cause issues there. And so those were kind of the two questions we started with. And so the one that I addressed, one of the first papers I worked on when I started here was the habitat question. Do we still have cold water habitat that could support Cisco in the future? And so I won't get too deep into the science on this. It's really not that complicated. We took these published thresholds from other lakes. There was work that was done in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, where they looked at basically vertical profiles of oxygen and temperature in the lakes that had Cisco versus the lakes that didn't. And they even did some more specific things, like they would locate schools of Cisco in the heat of summer and just figure out like what oxygen level are they seeking, what temperature level are they seeking. And they published these thresholds, like what are the cold water habitat requirements for Cisco. And so to address this question in Lake Erie, I took vertical oxygen and temperature profiles from EPA, and then there was also a lot of nearshore stuff from the state agencies. And I basically modeled that through time. I tried to figure out when and where habitat was most restricted, and then I mapped that using empirical Bayesian kriging, which is basically just hotspot mapping. And so at that time, I believe I started working on this project in 2018. I used a 10-year time series, 2007 to 2017. And I determined in that entire time period, cold water habitat was most limited in August of 2010. And so then I was like, okay, well, let's look at that month and let's map that across Lake Erie and see how much Cisco habitat is out there in the worst conditions. And what we learned is, not surprisingly, pretty much all of the East Basin is still adequate. So all of this over here, they would have no problem finding cold water habitat refugia in the heat of summer. And even parts of the eastern edge of the Central Basin, as you get over towards the Pennsylvania Ridge, there's habitat here as well. And so I looked through the kind of historical landing reports, which were often broken down by month. And you would see even during the peak of the Cisco fishery, early in the year, they're catching Cisco everywhere. And as you went into summer, it seemed like the Cisco were moving east. And so when you got to July and August, all of the landings were kind of in the East Basin. So they were probably going through the motions back then as well. I mean, you know, it used to get hot historically too. It's more exacerbated now, but so that was kind of a good confirmation of what we kind of suspected, because we do have healthy lake trout populations and they have more stringent habitat requirements. But it was good to be able to kind of map this out and get this out there. So yes, large amounts of cold water habitat still appears to exist. So the next question was, okay, we see reports of Cisco being occasionally captured just randomly. Is there remnant population? So if we were to try to bring back Cisco, and by we, the states, we don't do any stocking. USGS doesn't do, we just do science. But if the states decided to bring back Cisco, would they be stocking them on top of some sort of remnant, genetically distinct group of fish? And so, yes, we've had these reports of Cisco being occasionally captured. A lot of those were archived at the Great Lakes Science Center in Ann Arbor, and they were analyzed looking at morphology, because the lakes do have what we call different ecomorphotypes, and they're kind of morphologically unique. Sorry, I'm using big annoying words. They're physically different from the other lakes. They have different gill raker counts, different fin shapes, different head shapes. And so, yes, we took all these archived Cisco that had been captured in Lake Erie, and we looked at the morphology of them and then also the genetics of them, just to see, you know, are these matching with what used to be here, or are they matching maybe with some of the other lakes? And then in the meantime, I'd been doing some whitefish projects on the reefs in the West Basin, and I actually captured 3 true Cisco on Niagara Reef. I caught a couple in 2019, or 1 in 2019 and 2 in 2021. And those were true Cisco. They were not bloaters. So, sorry, I'm getting all out of order here. But a lot of the Cisco that have been showing up in Lake Erie are actually bloaters, which are, they look almost identical, but they're smaller, they're genetically distinct, and they live in much deeper water. And they were never native to Lake Erie. They're native to the deeper lakes, like Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario. And so the fact that a huge portion of what we're getting are bloaters, that means they're coming down from Lake Huron, right? All the Great Lakes are connected. We have all kinds of fish that spill out of Lake Huron. People catch king salmon, cohos, pinks. It's not that far of a swim from lower Lake Huron through the Detroit and Lake St. Clair and the St. Clair River. And so we were able to kind of discern that a lot of these fish are probably just coming out of Huron, but some of the true Cisco were still a little more questionable. And then I did have a commercial fisherman actually surrender to Cisco in December of 2023. So I've been in contact with a few commercial fishermen. And I asked them, I'm like, if you ever see a Cisco, call me up. And so one of the guys over towards Toledo did call me up, and he had captured a Cisco. So there are some floating around, but I'm not going to get ahead of myself. Yes.
The ones that you captured, was it always late fall?
Yeah, end of November, early December, they were often ripe and flowing. They were going through the motions of spawning, and they were spawning in spots where there was whitefish everywhere. So.
That was actually one of my questions earlier. It's, what is their spawning, like history?
Yeah, so generally they're similar to whitefish, but it seems like the whitefish come in and peak spawn is maybe Thanksgiving, because I often have to be out on the boat while my family's at home celebrating. It's great.
And they're spawning in the.
Yes, they're spawning at both. A lot of them, the lake whitefish come from the West Basin, probably the majority of what we see, but there's a healthy spawning population of lake whitefish off of Long Point and Long Point Bay on the Canadian side. And there's probably some near shore in Pennsylvania and New York. I've tried to get over there, and every time I try to get over there, it's like 8-foot waves. So, but it's on my list. I want to find some spawning whitefish over there as well. But yeah, so the whitefish come in first, usually around Thanksgiving, and the Cisco are usually the first week of December is when we see them, kind of at the tail end of the whitefish spawn. And so to answer these questions, okay, these Cisco we're seeing in Lake Erie, are they from Lake Erie or are they from somewhere else? The first thing I did is I went to museums and pulled out old specimens from Lake Erie before they went extinct. So I went to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, New York State Museum, which is all the way over on the east end of Lake Ontario, and some other places as well. And I was basically digging, 100-year-old Cisco out of these massive vats of formaldehyde. It was great. And we compared morphology. We looked at gill raker counts. We looked at features, head morphology features, fin lengths, so on and so forth. And then also concurrent with that, our geneticist in Ann Arbor, she, this was a total shot in the dark, but she was like, okay, so we have these historical scale samples from our office, from the Lake Erie Biological Station, going back to like 1928, before Cisco went extinct. And, they're 100 years old, dried out. But she's like, maybe we can get some viable DNA from that to do a genetic comparison. And unfortunately, you only have about a 30% success rate with that, but she was able to get viable DNA because we had thousands of scales. So it was one of those instances where I'm glad we didn't throw stuff away as an office. There are other times where I wish we would throw some more stuff away, but this worked out well. And yeah, so morphology wise, they were kind of aligning with what we would expect to see in Lake Huron. And then the genetics analysis kind of confirmed this. So this is principal components analysis. It's just an ordination technique. Really, all you need to think of is, oops, keep hitting the wrong button. Little clouds of similarly colored dots are more similar. So, this cloud is different from this cloud, it's different from that, it's different that. And so the green over here would be the historical Lake Erie Cisco prior to extinction, those scales from 1928. And then in this cloud, it's kind of hard to see, but there's like 4 little gray dots. Those are the ones I got in Lake Erie. And so they're not matching up with what used to be in Lake Erie. And they're actually matching up with over here. This is the Saugeen, Bruce Peninsula Cisco. Those are Lake Huron. And it's lower Lake Huron. So it's really not a far swim for them to come through the St. Clair River, through Lake St. Clair, through to Detroit. So we confirmed that, yeah, the Cisco we're getting in Lake Erie are most likely washing out of Lake Huron, and they are not matching with what was here historically. So the next step, and I don't know how we pulled this off, but we were able to get support to just take 100 Cisco from, there's these massive reintroduction efforts happening in Lake Huron and Saginaw Bay. And so we grabbed 100 Cisco and we put tags in them, and we just wanted to see if we put Cisco in Lake Erie, will they survive through the summer? And where will they go? What will the movements be? And so I don't know if you guys are all familiar with the GLaDOS network. There's the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry network out there where we basically have a bunch of receivers, and if you tag a fish, you can basically track its movement throughout the lake. It's a lot of work, but I don't know if you've seen the like walleye migration map and all that, but so we're leveraging that existing network, and we tagged 100 Cisco. We released 50 right out of Huron, our office did, and then our partners in New York released 50 off of Dunkirk. One of the things we included in those fish were predation tags. It's basically just a digestible fuse that if it gets eaten by, say, if that Cisco, the Cisco are going in about this big, right? If that Cisco gets eaten by a walleye, that little fuse will degrade, and when it swings by a receiver, we'll get data that says this fish was eaten. So we wanted to see how many of them got eaten. They were a forage fish historically. They supported, big lake trout, big walleye. I'm sure muskies and pike ate them as well.
If a fisherman caught a Cisco, would he know what it is? I mean, is it similar to another fish?
The commercial guys are pretty good because they see so many, and they would be able to distinguish a whitefish from a Cisco. But because, the anglers out there are mostly getting walleye and perch, I rarely hear of like whitefish bycatch. I think a lot of anglers just wouldn't know. But I don't know how they would catch them. I mean, they're out there and they're eating little zooplankton. And
They're not likely to be spot on.
they're not a likely bycatch. Yeah. But no, I don't think anglers would really necessarily know. Yes.
Are they particularly, do they hang out near the surface? I'm wondering how likely it is that they get picked off by birds or mammal predators.
I'm not going to answer that question yet because that's part of the next slide. Excellent foresight. But yeah, great question. So yeah, we wanted to monitor survival through the summer and then also see how many got preyed upon. And the Cisco we were putting in were 4 years old. They had lived in a hatchery their whole life. They were like bright green, completely naive. Well, I won't get ahead of myself. Long story short, the Cisco we put in, certainly in the West, I know this is kind of a small, but as the summer moved on, a lot of them moved east. Plenty of them made it through the summer, which was reassuring. A lot of them were eaten. That predation tag did go off, especially the ones in the East Basin. So again, we have a healthy population of lake trout. A lot of those lake trout are anywhere from 8 pounds to 20 pounds. Historically, those lake trout probably were eating a lot of Cisco. So we must have triggered some sort of genetic memory or whatever. They're like, oh, Cisco, I'm going to eat that. So they got hammered pretty good. But then we also had a lot of fish that would move around. And I know I have this little alien abduction note. They would move around, they'd be by a receiver, and then they would just vanish, which we don't see that. There was no predation tag. If they'd been eaten by a fish, you would expected, that fuse would dissolve, and then we would get that data. A lot of them just vanished. And based on some of the evidence we saw, one of the tags that vanished then showed up later near one of the islands where there's a lot of cormorants roosting. And so we do think a lot of them got hammered by birds. And it's funny, you talked about them swimming on the top. When we released them, and obviously we hadn't done this before. If we could do it over again, we would have done it a little more strategically. But as we were releasing them at the surface, there were birds picking a few of them off. And they did just kind of swim right on the top. So they do appear vulnerable to bird predation. If we could do it again, we'd probably stock them at night or use some sort of release device to just stock them at depth. And then also just, stocking these 4-year-old naive fish. If you look at other studies kind of in the realm of aquaculture, there's all kind of methods to kind of get fish accustomed to predation. Like they have robo birds in some hatcheries that scare the fish. so that they learn to have that kind of flight response. So there's like ways to train these fish to not be so, for lack of a better word, dumb. But anyways, they made it through the summer, several of them, which kind of confirmed what we were thinking, that there's probably the habitat here. Let me let this person. Oh, it's not gonna.
There is somebody.
Javon will do them.
Okay, cool. So why do I have a random picture of Johnny Appleseed? I'll get to that. So one of the most exciting things, kind of most recently, was this push to maybe find these Lake Erie Cisco, which if you remember that genetic analysis that we did showed, they were kind of their own cloud of points. They were genetically distinct, right? I'll go back just a little bit. These are the original, now extinct Lake Erie Cisco. And so I've been working with partners, mostly in Pennsylvania, to try to figure out, can we find these somewhere else? And so back in the day, the concept of invasive species and kind of keeping ecosystems intact, not bringing in some alien species, for lack of a better word, that whole concept didn't really become popularized till the 1990s. So prior to that, fish management agencies would just spread things around. That's why I have a picture of Johnny Appleseed. They would take fish from Lake Erie and dump them in some inland lake, and so on and so forth. And so there was these old school management practices. And we had heard, and my colleagues in Pennsylvania had heard, that there might be some Cisco in this lake in northeastern PA, all the way over by Scranton, like 8 hours across the state. Now, Pennsylvania only borders Lake Erie. It doesn't border any other Great Lake. So initially it's like, well, if there's Cisco in that lake, they're probably coming from Lake Erie. They're not native at all in that region. And so that has been kind of a cool development recently. Like I showed earlier, Lake Erie Cisco are genetically distinct. Morphologically, they were distinct. They were called the Lake Erie Jumbo Cisco. And you can look at just images of them. This is kind of your standard Cisco from the other lakes. This is what Lake Erie used to produce. These images, or drawings rather, are from like 1910, before they went extinct. So in addition to, obviously, they're like super deep body, there's some gill raker count differences, there's some head morphology differences, and there's some fin length differences as well. And so there is this kind of unique form of Cisco in Lake Erie. And so we had reports of occasional Cisco captured through the ice at Crystal Lake. And so we wanted to see, can we go out and capture some of those fish? And can we figure out if they are actually the original Lake Erie Cisco? And so, I showed you that image of like the super fat Lake Erie Cisco on the top and just kind of the more slender one on the bottom. I mean, what does this one look like? This is the one specimen that was captured in 2017 by the Fish Commission. Looks an awful lot like the historical Lake Erie Jumbo Cisco. And then we were digging through some of the archived correspondence at the Fish Commission, the Pennsylvania. Sorry, I got to be more clear because there's the Great Lakes Fish Commission. They had these old records going back to like the early 1900s that showed that fish were being transferred from the Erie, PA hatchery, which is in Erie on Lake Erie, to this Pleasant Mount hatchery, which the Pleasant Mount hatchery is like 6 miles from Crystal Lake. And there was this one little bit of evidence that we found where it said in 1928, the hatchery from Pleasant Mount acquired Cisco eggs from the Lake Erie hatchery and liberated them in nearby waters. They couldn't say we put them in Crystal Lake or we put them in Lake Wallenpaupack. They just kept it super vague. So I'm like, oh, great. But the evidence really suggested that they took Lake Erie Cisco in the late 20s and stocked them here in Crystal Lake. So we went out in 2021. We had no idea. Like, if we get one, we're excited. So we did gill nets one night, and we ended up getting 28 of them. And look at the body depths on these fish. And a lot of these were big. And if you look at the old reports from Lake Erie, they called them the Lake Erie Jumbo Cisco because they're almost whitefish sized. Some of these fish are 5-6 pounds, whereas in the other lakes, their Ciscos are maybe 2-3 pounds. So immediately we're super excited. Like, these look like the original Lake Erie Cisco. So the first thing we did was we then compared the morphology, kind of the physical features to those museum collections that I mentioned before. And they were matching up really well with that. And then once Amanda finished her genetics work with those scales, again, that we had kept in our office from the 1920s, it was perfect overlap. So both the morphology and the genetics confirmed what we were suspecting, that, yeah, these are Lake Erie Cisco. And this is just the morphology plot. But the red cloud would be Crystal Lake 2021. And then this cloud would be a group of historical Cisco, kind of from over in that area, from near Erie, Pennsylvania. And you see perfect overlap of those two clouds. And it's kind of interesting. So the scale samples that we had in our office were collected at Erie, Pennsylvania in 1928. That record that I was talking about that said we took Cisco from Erie, PA and stocked them in nearby waters, that happened in 1928. So the genetic group of fish we're comparing to were basically captured in the same year and in the same area. And I should have thrown that PCA up from her results. Maybe I do have it. No, I don't, but it's perfect overlap. So it's really like, what are the odds that we would get, these fish that were likely taken from Erie, Pennsylvania in 1928, and that would coincide perfectly with the scale samples we had at our office. It was just total dumb luck, but ultimately we were able to confirm that, yeah, this is like a Jurassic Park of the original Lake Erie Cisco. And so now we're kind of in the, now we're kind of moving towards restoration. So May of this year, New York stocked 70,000 Cisco at Dunkirk. So they've been gone for forever, and 70,000 went back in. That's not a huge amount. This is not a full-blown restoration program yet. This is an experimental thing. So all these fish are going to be coated wire tags, or coated wire tags. Some are going to have acoustic tags in them. And we're just going to try to learn what we can about how they're surviving, where we should stock them. It's just kind of a learning thing. But it's a historical moment nonetheless. And then I saw, I haven't talked with my colleagues from PA in a while, but I saw this article just a few weeks ago where it seems like Pennsylvania is now thinking of taking those Crystal Lake fish and starting their own restoration program. So super exciting time to be in. I just feel honored to be a part of it. To be able to find a fish that was assumed to be extinct, and then also potentially supported the largest freshwater fishery in human history. It's just kind of a momentous occasion. It's just been super exciting to work with these people and learn what we're learning. And so one of the things I did last summer, I didn't really give you any background on Crystal Lake. It's this small little 200 hectare glacial lake, and it's not huge. It's very small. So moving forward, it's like, can this lake support like an egg take for a restoration effort? We don't know how many are out there. Could be a few hundred, could be a few thousand. So we went out this past summer, we did a hydroacoustic survey, which just think of it as like a super fancy fish finder where you can kind of quantify fish out there. Specifically in the cold water habitat, we went out when it was stratified, so we knew that the Cisco there would be hanging out down around the thermocline. And we did a bunch of transects, and then we also, it's super clear, it's a glacial kettle lake. We also flew this ROV at the thermocline, and we were able to get lake trout and Cisco on camera. So there's lake trout there as well, and that's a whole nother can of worms. With those lake trout probably came from Lake Erie, and the Lake Erie form of lake trout is also extinct. So we're not even getting to that yet. But Crystal Lake's just an amazing place. And so, yeah, we're able to, we're still working on that data analysis, but it does look like there's about 2,000 to 3,000 Cisco in that lake. If you look at what we caught a few slides ago, there's numerous different size classes. We aged all those fish. It seems like there's a lot of reproductive success. We had 4-year-old fish, we had 20-year-old fish. So it does seem like that population is stable, and it probably does have enough individuals to support an egg take if PA decides to move forward with this. I don't know how my slide got messed up, but it did. And so as we move towards Cisco restoration in Lake Erie, I just wanted to briefly touch base on, some of the potential benefits. Obviously, it supported a huge fishery. They're great to eat. I did a little back of the envelope calculation to see, if we were able to harvest 26 million pounds a year, what would that be worth in today's dollars? And just using market prices for other lakes, Lake Michigan still has a healthy population. That fishery alone would be worth about $300 to $700 million per year if that were to come back. Yes,
You said they're great to eat. Have you tried one?
I have.
What
Not
did-
from Lake Erie, obviously.
What did it taste like?
It was kind of, if you had lake whitefish, it's kind of like a more delicate version of that.
Okay.
So it's like what a perch is to a walleye, I would say a Cisco is to. It's great. It's really good.
You boil it or fry it?
The one I had, I was in Michigan and it was smoked, but it was really good. So obviously there could be a huge economic benefit there. They were a huge part of the ecosystem historically. And so there could be these unforeseen benefits. I mean, if it was pumping out 49 million pounds, obviously they were abundant and important. But they could also provide for predatory game fish a more stable forage base. Walleye are relying a lot on gizzard shad. And as you go to the East Basin, we actually see a lot of alewife. And those are pretty prone to winter kill, winter die-offs. And so their populations are constantly fluctuating. Cisco would be far more stable. Obviously, walleye aren't going to eat, a 500 millimeter Cisco, but they have lots of babies. And so there's lots of juvenile Cisco out there that would be a good forage base. And we know historically Lake Erie used to pump out 20-pound walleye and 70-pound lake trout. We don't see lake trout anywhere near that size these days. I've seen maybe a 28-pounder in all my years on the East Basin. But there's, obviously a lot of benefits that could come out of this. And so, yeah, closing thoughts. I would say that these are, kind of exciting times. Cisco's are going back into Lake Erie. New York is leading the charge, and Pennsylvania appears to be kind of following their lead. We still have a lot to learn. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the lake trout restoration program. It's been in place for a while. It really kind of started going in the 1980s in a major way. They've had success bringing back the populations of adults in the East Basin, but we're not seeing a lot of natural reproduction. So I don't want to get too excited because the lake's changed a lot. We have dry-scented mussels everywhere, other invasives. Things are different. And we're only seeing maybe 1% to 5% of the lake trout in our surveys are wild recruits. So we're sustaining that population through stocking. And so as I think about this, we may get all excited, put all these Cisco in, and they may not do their thing. But I'm hopeful for positive results because if you look at the literature, Cisco were very flexible spawners. They can spawn just about anywhere. And they have a much shorter life history. They reach sexual maturity at like 2 to 5 years. So things will be much faster pace. Lake trout are slow growing, long lived. They often don't reach maturity until 5 to 8 years. They'll live up to 30 years old. And they're definitely obligate reef spawners. They're lithophilic and they need clean substrate. Cisco don't appear to be that way. I do have hope that there may be some success here, but we'll have to wait and see. And with that, I'll take questions. And I did want to throw a couple things up here. When I first started at the Lake Erie Biological Stations, one of the first things my supervisor said was, you need to get this book and you need to read it. Because I was coming from Chesapeake Bay. I didn't have a Great Lakes background. And so if anyone is learning, wants to learn more about kind of the history of fishing and fisheries and other things, invasive species, everything in the Great Lakes, this is a great book. I do think coming from Chesapeake Bay, I do think the Great Lakes is managed better than anywhere else I've been before. We work on consensus. We work as a team. It's a healthy work environment. There's not a lot of infighting. I do think we're the model system, and we kind of have a lot of evidence to back that up because we were on the brink numerous occasions with water quality. I mean, the Cuyahoga River was on fire. A lot of our fish were almost wiped out by sea lamprey. And so it's a really cool book. And then the other thing, I would watch the Fish Thief documentary on Prime. That kind of talks about the whole sea lamprey thing. And USGS, the Great Lakes Science Center, had a big role in that. We weren't called that back then, but it was a scientist with us that basically discovered TFM, which was able to ultimately control sea lamprey and kind of get us out of that major crisis. So that's a really cool documentary if you haven't seen it. The Fish Commission put it out, I don't know, a year ago. But with that, I will take questions.
Talking about bringing back- Yeah. Fish.
Sturgeon.
Yeah.
Oh,
Is there competition going on? Are there a lot of other places bringing back fish?
There are a lot of places bringing back fish. Is the word competition being used for between the fish or between people?
People.
Oh, I mean,
I wouldn't think, no, I don't think so. I think we're doing a decent job of putting resources together. I don't think there'll be a conflict there. That's a good question, though. I haven't really thought about that. I do think that we're having to build hatchery capacity. That'd be more of a question for the Fish and Wildlife Service. They handle that end of it. I think there are pots of money available for them to do these kind of things because the Great Lakes, I mean, recreational fishing alone in the Great Lakes is worth at least $5 billion a year. So doing these kind of things, I don't know, you're getting a huge return on your investment. So there's money there to be had. But no, I don't think there's a direct conflict there. I do know the Fish and Wildlife Service is working to ramp up hatchery production of Cisco and some of the other lakes. Particularly Saginaw Bay is getting something like 2 million Cisco a year right now. And I think Lake Ontario is getting a bunch of bloater. I don't know. There's a lot going on. It's hard to keep up with, but no, I don't see that as being a direct conflict. Yes.
It's the source of the New York fish that were stocked.
The New York fish that were stocked. Oh, those are Lake Huron fish. So that's something I should talk about. So with Amanda's genetic work, those scales that were from Erie, Pennsylvania from 1928 that matched Crystal Lake perfectly, they were their own unique thing. But then since then, we found some scales from the West Basin, kind of closer to the mouth of the Detroit River. And it does look like historically there have always been fish that have been coming down the pipe from Lake Huron. So the fact that New York is putting Lake Huron fish in now shouldn't be an issue. They've always been there. It would be cool if down the road we start putting some of the original ones back, and I think that's what PA is ultimately striving to do. So, great question.
Also a question for, so thank you, Perry.
Awesome.
yeah, so I have a question for you.
Yes.
Both on like, you know, what is like the distance that they'll, or what is our move like time look like?
That's a good question. I should look at that more. They're not moving as extensively as, say, walleye or like, you know, the muskies they tagged in the Detroit River, which are going to Buffalo and back all the time. But they do appear to be making.
Sorry, can you repeat the question for the online people thinking or the audience as well?
Sure. The question was just kind of about generalities of, you know, how much are these fish moving in Lake Erie and in other lakes? Cisco being these fish. Sorry, should have specified. I'll go back to this slide here. So a lot of the fish that we stocked in the West, but I shouldn't say stocked, we really just released some tagged fish. It's not really a stocking event. 100 fish is not very significant in Lake Erie. A lot of them did move all the way down to the edge of the Central Basin, and some of them went all the way to the East Basin. And that's not surprising based on, you know, the oxythermal thresholds, the cold water habitat requirements. We would expect that. But if you look at the fish that were put in at Dunkirk, well, they found the cold water habitat that they needed. So they kind of just hung out. So I wouldn't say, you know, these fish aren't going through the spawning motions yet. So it might change, you know, as 70,000 fish go in, you might see what you would expect. You know, the walleye will also move east as things get warmer, and then they'll come back west to spawn in the summer. So the West Basin is, you know, kind of the lake's nursery and spawning area. Maybe Cisco will do that, maybe they won't. If you look at the other lakes, there's some that spawn in 40 feet of water over mud, and there's some that appear to go up on reefs. We don't really know what Cisco do in terms of spawning. It seems like they do everything. So anyways, I'm probably rambling, but is that good enough? Okay. Yes.
Back to Crystal Lake there. Discuss some predators. Does that small lake count in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the shallow zone, so it's a fairly cool, natural, what we call a glacial kettle lake. So it's naturally formed from a glacier melting. And so it stratifies in the summer. And in the shallow nearshore zones, you have what you would expect: largemouth bass, bluegill, your typical warm water assemblage. But then as you go off at about, I don't know, 7-8 meters of water depth, it becomes strongly stratified, and there's cold water down there. And there are Cisco, obviously, and lake trout. And so those lake trout were also probably taken from Erie, Pennsylvania, and stocked in there. And the original Lake Erie lake trout has been extinct for a while too. So there's a whole nother realm of science there that we haven't even pursued yet. But I hope that answers your question.
What an ace in the hole to have.
I know.
Really population right there.
I know. It's super exciting. Yeah.
Any other questions? Not any others from online, so thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Just for everyone's memory boost, August 1st is our next Science Friday, and a couple of the presenters are in here. They will be our intern crew for the summer, and they're going to be presenting their summer projects. So August 1st, 12 o'clock, as usual, be here or be square. Thank you so much, Joe. That was
Thank
great.
you.
Joe,
Oh,
sorry, we have two more questions online.
oh.
The first one is, how do Cisco perform in the hatcheries? How are they to transport compared to other hatchery fish? Is the hatchery production well defined, or do we have a way to go with the science? That's the first question.
Okay. I can address that. Sorry. Yeah, so they do have obviously more stringent requirements, and transport can be tricky. I wouldn't try to haul a bunch of Cisco across country in July and August. But I've personally transported some around in both early spring and then in the winter, and they do fine. I do think, as far as the hatchery production end of things, I'm not super well versed with that, but I'm pretty sure the folks at Fish and Wildlife Service that are stocking into Saginaw Bay, I think they've got it pretty well dialed in. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think they're having a hard time producing fish, and they're putting, I think, 1.2 million Cisco into Saginaw Bay every year. So I think they've got it figured out.
And then there was one
Okay.
more question. How did water quality?
How did water quality contribute to the decline, extinction of Cisco historically, in addition to overfishing? And how may present conditions affect restoration efforts? That's a good question. You should dig into the Langlois-Van Oosten debates, because they've written extensively about this. I do think there was a role there, obviously. I do think that water quality is probably better now than it was in the 50s and 60s. But things are warmer. But the reality is the East Basin is such a deep, stable volume of water that even as temperatures are warming, there's still suitable habitat towards that end. Now, the real interesting side of the equation is it does seem like Cisco and lake whitefish do better when there is ice cover in terms of recruitment and reproduction. And so we know for a fact that we definitely have less ice cover now than we did historically. So that's something we're going to have to look into as these efforts ramp up. So yeah, there could be issues there with recruitment. But again, you never know unless you try. But that's a great question. And then there was a question about predation. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
It's on the other screen.
Oh, okay.